Stirner believes that the state is fundamentally illegitimate. And here, I think we have to understand the state as monopoly of violence in the Max Weber tradition. This, as I understand it, is the so-called right Hegelian view, the view which teaches Hegel in an essentially individualist lens. In other words, Marx is the left Hegelian, and Max Weber and Max Stirner are kind of the right Hegelians. I haven't read Hegel, so I can't speak much about that. Anyway, the state is the monopoly of violence. I think this definition is true in the ultimate sense, and it's useful because when the left-wing camp talks about abolishing, money or abolishing any kind of inequality between people, they're doing so understanding structural violence as the same thing as the state. So it's not that they think that inequality requires a monopoly of violence per se, but they recognize class distinctions as involving a unilateral coercion, right? So my view maybe lands somewhere a bit in the middle. I think that without the state, a money economy would not really be supported, and wage labor as we know it wouldn't really make any sense. Because essentially to have wage labor, you have to have two classes of people, the capitalist or the owner and the worker or proletarian. And if you imagine that you have like perfect class mobility, there's no state enforcing kind of rigid whatever, you got to ask yourself, why would you choose to be a proletarian if you could just choose to be a capitalist instead? I don't think it boils down to just the matter of hard work and enterprise, not ultimately. I think that the so-called anarcho-capitalists are really living in a liberal fantasy. They're essentially imagining the best possible version of neoliberalism where there just is no state, and I really don't think that it works, at least not in a stochastic sense. Removing the state removes the parameters that make a market economy viable in the first place. And yeah, I'm aware that there are places that are essentially failed states that have a multipolarity of violence that could be described as, in some sense, anarchic, that nevertheless have capitalist principles, but they could never exist in isolation, in a vacuum. They only exist on the peripheries of other economic systems that have stable currencies, or at least usable currencies, and a stable enough world order that supports a market economy, right? So I think what's going on in the imagination of the so-called anarcho-capitalist is that they want to remove the state, the monopoly of violence, and then just have everybody recognize the property rights as they are today. And there's a lot that is very, very wrong with this idea. So, right now, let's just say, I don't know how much they actually possess, but BlackRock, probably possesses, massive amounts of real estate. So if there is no state that, the citizens that make up the corporation of BlackRock pay allegiance to, then BlackRock essentially is an empire. And if their property rights are respected / enforced at like a systematic level, then what you have is just a state. You have to have the correct definition of state in order to understand anarchism, and this applies to both the left and the right. So if you have a monopoly of violence, then you have a state, and it's very, very hard to remove the state without implementing a new state. This is why I sometimes say that I'm not so much an anarchist as an anarchologist. I study the concept of anarchy itself, and in so doing, derive what I see as really the only truly anarchist philosophy, or maybe I shouldn't say the only one, but what I see as the anarchist ideology. Perhaps somewhere along the way we might decide that we don't actually want anarchy when we understand what it is, and maybe some of us in the room might say, okay, well, I'm just going to stop calling myself an anarcho-communist, and I'm just going to be a communist, or I'm going to stop calling myself an anarcho-capitalist and just call myself a liberal, right? Small L, liberal, that is. But that being said, I agree with Max Weber that the definition of state is monopoly of violence. The definition of anarchy is the absence of state. It could also be calqued as unrule or unruliness. So an anarchy is an unrule, a state of unrule. But that's kind of just the etymological, definition. Anarchy is the absence of a state. State is a monopoly of violence. Ergo, anarchy is multipolarity of violence. So here, you do have to understand the concept of politics as violence. Politics as violence, class society as structural violence. So, in other words, the only thing that can cause there to be simultaneously a class of capitalists and a class of proletarians is structural violence causing the proletarians to remain proletarians. Let's say that you have a farm, and that farm has, 100 people's worth of land. It's been a long time since I read my, medieval economic, treatises to understand, how much land a person can farm. So forgive me if my numbers are wrong, but let's say that you have 1,000 acres, and there's 100 farmers with 10 acres, and you hire them as wage laborers to work on your farm. What would compel them to be your hired employees rather than to just simply have each of them a farm of their own on your land? Well, you say, well, it's property rights because this is my land, right? So, it's your land, so if they don't have land, they have to work for you. But why do they not have land? Who took the land from them? This is where I lean the most, kind of left on my thinking of anarchy, is that if there's no monopoly of violence, then the land is everybody's up for grabs. You can stake off as much land as you want and try to defend it with weapons. Okay, sure, I can't stop you from doing that, but you're not gonna have a workforce. You're not gonna have anybody who wants to work for you if they can just go work for themselves. And in my view, the only thing that can stop people from being able to just work for themselves is violence. So you could capture people in war, enslave them, and make them work on your farm, or you could take people's land by force, and then there's nothing left for them to do but work for you. Both of those involve violence, and if you're successful at the endeavor, then they involve a monopoly of violence, and therefore cannot be described as anarchy at all. So my thinking essentially revolves around kind of an original land redistribution, or at least a complete revolution in the mode of land ownership. People come to physically possess the land, reside on it, dwell on it, farm it. And there is a certain sense of respect for property rights, but it's not the capitalist version of property rights. Because the right to property in a truly anarchic system, in an anarcho-egoist system, does not involve any kind of legal process. I would say that property rights in my system are a mutual recognition of respect for the land that each other possesses, right? So each anarch has a certain amount of land and agrees, not to take land from the other ones. But it's not like there's inheritance or sale or anything of the kind. I mean, deals like that can be hashed out on an individual basis. So that I'm not saying that at the death of a landowner that his land has to be returned to the state or divvied up in some systematic way. That's really up for grabs, and whoever physically possesses it, and deals can be worked out between individuals to recognize certain schemes of inheritance. But whenever there's a conflict, you essentially have to resort to the law of the jungle to decide who wins in a conflict. So the weakness of my system, I would say, is that it tends toward the re-establishment of states as individuals kind of, or as groups of individuals kind of figure out what the best, simplest, most peaceful, most effective way to administer their affairs is. It sort of develops into what you might call like a neo-feudal kind of setup. And this is, I'm not going to say that it's by design, but I am going to say that it's inevitable, because anarchism is essentially, or anarchy is essentially, a return to the state of things before the state acquired fixity. And I don't think there's anything, any system, any structure that can be called anarchic that is going to prevent the reestablishment of any kind of state later on in a systematic way. I do think that anarchs can have a understanding, a belief, an unwritten law or a code of ethics or whatever among them that will tend toward preserving the anarchy, but I don't think that it's possible for that to operate in a systematic fashion. So this is where the left anarchists and the left Hegelians go wrong, is that they want to secure a permanent utopia with like a doctrine of permanent revolution or a vanguard party, or there's variations on this, but what all the anarcho-communists have in common is that they think that they can make the anarchy last by instituting certain kind of policies or rules, which I don't think. Basically, I think that they either can't be described as anarchic if they're too strong, or if they're too weak, then they don't do anything. So if you set up a system where, economic equality is enforced either by taxes or by just like public rituals and coercive, what I mean, like behaviors or situations that are imposed on the individual to force them to keep everything nice and anarcho-communist, then what you have is a democratic state. You just have a system that controls people's lives, but just one where the individual people have more say in how it is run, which is fine. I mean, ad hoc democracy is fine. I'm not opposed to it. As an anarcho-egoist, essentially my outlook on the whole situation is that whatever works is fine, and if it can't be described as anarchic, then okay, fine, but don't call it anarchic if it isn't, because I think that true anarchy is really anarcho-egoism. At least that's what I think. I remain to be corrected. I haven't been persuaded otherwise, right? So, and then on the other hand, the anarcho-capitalists want to abolish, quote-unquote, the state, but don't recognize monopolies of violence as actually constituting a state. And they believe in the NAP, and this is like their how they convince themselves that they're right, is that, they say, we enforce the non-aggression principle, so there's no violence. But the non-aggression principle is just a ban on overturning the structural violence that already exists economically. And I think I don't want to be I don't want to be misunderstood here, because I think that the anarcho-capitalists could be honest with themselves and actually say, yes, that's a good thing and that's what we believe. Because if you understand that politics and economics is always fundamentally violent, that it is the manifestation of violence, then you understand that to recognize property rights in a way that's stable and allows for capitalism fundamentally requires a monopoly of violence in some direction from some source, guaranteeing the property rights of the capitalist class to the exclusion of the working class, right? So, and they could be honest with themselves and say that, yeah, okay, actually we do just want a plutocratic state, and that's what we want, So, politics is violence, and we don't have the NAP because we have multipolarity of violence. So, the fundamental possibility for violence is and has to be the underlying fabric of an anarchic society. Anarcho-pacifism doesn't make any sense to me because it's like apolitical, right? If you choose to be nonviolent, then anybody who chooses to be violent can control you just by saying so, you know? Violence doesn't have to be like physical harm, by the way. I think a good definition of violence is just actions that diminish the free choice of other people. So it's kind of the same thing as coercion. We can replace violence with coercion. I like violence because it's more clear, it's more visceral, and because it also does involve like physically, like killing people. So the potential for violence is the omnipresent fact of an anarchic society. And that doesn't mean that an anarchic society has to be particularly violent. It just means that every decision that's made, every structure or every organization or association is based on the potential for violence. This is it's Hobbesianism, right? I could kill you, you could kill me. We agree not to kill each other because there's no reason to do that. We can contract like a marriage between, like my daughter and your son or whatever, to secure that peace and thereby kind of expand the sphere of peace, expand the number of people who mutually recognize the violence in each other and agree to essentially just live in peace, right? Now, of course, if this expanded to the level of like a tribe, then yeah, if that tribe had a chieftain whose authority was unquestioned or unquestionable or could be enforced, then at that point we would no longer be talking about an anarchy. And that's the structure, that's the pattern or system by which my system tends to kind of lose anarchy and become something else. But I truly believe that is inevitable, because my anarchism is not utopian. It's not about permanent revolution. It's about anti-civilization. It's about anti-civilization, and it's about Stirner's philosophy. Because what Stirner does that kind of sets him apart, in my mind, from other anarchist thinkers is that he doesn't just reject the state on kind of like the principles of inequality or inefficiency or some kind of like pragmatic reason why we shouldn't have the state or why we shouldn't have government. He rejects the very idea of a state and a fixed idea and a monopoly of violence on first principles. He basically says that it's fundamentally wrong for any man to submit to the coercion of any other man, which paradoxically, and I do think that anarchy is always a paradox and is always in dialectical tension with monarchy, the fact that it's wrong for any man to submit to the coercion of any other man means that every man is constantly using his coercion to try to influence the world around him, like unsuccessfully. Or in other words, the perfect anarch, the perfect member of an anarchic society, is an absolute dictator over himself who cannot successfully exert his dictatorial influence on anybody else. That's essentially what it means to be an anarchist. And I don't necessarily lean into the idea of egoism per se. I don't think that people should necessarily go after, seek out whatever their ego tells them on like a first principles basis. That's what Stirner believed. I don't necessarily hold to that, but I do believe that like an absolute self-interest is always the way to go. And of course, just to reiterate this to the other kind of right anarchists, the anarcho-capitalists, the difference between my view and your view is that you guys believe that everybody should seek their own benefit and therefore be like good little capitalists. But my point in response is that if everybody's seeking their own benefit, then there's not going to be a distinction between capitalists and proletarians, because the proletarians will just overthrow the capitalists. In other words, I don't call for a proletarian revolution like the communists do, but I think that a proletarian revolution is kind of by definition the only possible consequence of an actual anarchic state, because it's sort of like a first principles thing, sort of definitions thing. The definition of what keeps proletarians in a subordinate position is monopoly of violence. If there's not a monopoly of violence, then there's nothing causing class distinctions. Nothing causing class distinctions, right? This isn't saying that we need to establish left-wing socialism in order to get rid of class distinctions because they are bad in and of themselves. It's more like class distinction and statehood is the same thing to a certain extent. So that's why I say that you have to understand the state first as monopoly of violence. You have to understand anarchy as the multipolarity of violence, and you have to recognize that that means that guaranteed property rights and things like that are not possible. Or put another way, your property rights are only going to be respected by the people that are members of your union of egoist anarchists. So when anarcho-capitalists talk about respect for private property, it's sort of like, okay, well, I might respect your private property, but if you're oppressing me, then I'm going to stop respecting your private property and I'm going to overthrow you and be a barbarian. You could try to stop me, but you'd have to try to stop all of us. And I posit that if the capitalists successfully stopped all of the proletarians from gaining their freedom, then it's no longer an anarchy. That's literally just like a feudal or plutocratic state. You can't argue that there's anything anarchic about using force to keep people in oppression. It just doesn't. That's a catch-22, right? So the only way to have people oppressed is to have them voluntarily oppressed, which is an oxymoron. So I also think that, in a funny way, like the anarcho-capitalist framework only makes sense to people that are so bourgeois in their philosophy of life and outlook that they actually think that people would voluntarily be wage laborers, which is just an absurd premise if you ask me.